All right. We are live. Peace to everybody in the chat, in the panel. We had some technical difficulties. Sorry about that, but we are live right now in YouTube land. How you doing, brother?
Yeah, I'm doing well. How about you?
Oh man, I'm good. I'm good. Glad to have you on the show. Let me just make sure that everything is broadcasting to where it's broadcasting correctly, and we can jump right into the show. Where you at these days, man?
Me, Central Florida right now.
Central Florida. Okay, okay, okay.
Located in Orlando.
Oh, you where the weather is nice. The weather is good.
Yeah, it's nice weather outside right now.
That's good, man. It's good. Okay, everything seems to be broadcasting to the right place. We had to switch YouTube channels. Typically we be on the Mossy, but there is some difficulties going on with our account, which we have to appeal to YouTube about. But it should be resolved within the week. But we had this backup plan, so I always got a backup plan to get young brothers on the show. So I know y'all probably looking at this like this ain't Kofi, but surprise, Blak Pantha is taking over today. And for those watching on my YouTube channel, I appreciate it. As y'all know, I like to bring qualified people on the show to have meaningful conversations pertaining to the African phenomenon. So today we got brother Dwayne Wong-Omowale, Pan Africanist, author of several books. I'm quite jealous because I'm still working on mine. But we got a brother that's well versed in African phenomenon today, and this is going to be a good show. It's definitely going to be a good show. I'm excited about having this brother on. Been watching you on Facebook, and meaningful conversations, meaningful information is being passed. So give us a little introduction, brother, your background and things of that nature.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Georgetown, Guyana, which is in South America. So I moved to the United States when I was 3, and my experience within the Pan African movement has been as a researcher, a scholar. As you mentioned, I've written several books. I'm working on number 20 right now, actually, and I've also been an activist. I've been involved in various different community efforts, both here in Central Florida, where I'm located, and I've also assisted different struggles across the African continent, across the Caribbean. So I definitely try to keep myself as busy as I can within this global African struggle that we're dealing with.
Awesome, man. When you're putting in a lot of work, I mean, book number 20, man. We got 19 books as a group. This brother got 20 books on his own. Man, that's some serious work, man. And we appreciate and applaud you for those efforts. So
Yeah.
I have to ask this question: why Pan Africanism?
Well, as I said before, I was born in Guyana, so I think that kind of gave me a unique perspective on the importance of Pan-Africanism because coming from a country like Guyana that had a history of African people being enslaved, then after slavery there was a struggle against British colonialism, and then colonialism ended, and for the last 5 decades, Africans in Guyana have still been struggling against neocolonialism and against different forms of oppression that have persisted even though colonialism has ended. So I was born into that environment, and then moving to the United States, I started seeing some parallels between the struggle against slavery in Guyana and the rest of the Caribbean, and the struggle against slavery in the United States. I saw parallels between the anti-colonial struggle and the civil rights movement. So for me, one of the things that sparked Pan-Africanism was my interest in Pan-Africanism was just being able to look out at the global African experience around the world and recognizing wherever we are in the world as a people, we're oppressed. And what I began to recognize was this is a global system of oppression that we're dealing with, and it's been very deliberately designed to be a global system which keeps African people across the world oppressed. So for me, my interest in Pan-Africanism, it started as just a mere observation. I didn't necessarily know about the history of the Pan-African movement or anything along those lines. I just, I started recognizing that wherever I seem to find people that look like me across the face of the world, there's always the same history of oppression and poverty and that type of situation. So I started to investigate, and that's one of the reasons why I got into Pan-African history, just trying to figure out what is it that caused African people around the world to be in the conditions that we're in. I think a lot of us who aren't familiar with this history tend to internalize certain racial stereotypes with African people about how we're a backwards people, we're inferior people, and some people even try to put like a religious spin on it, like Black people have been cursed by God or some kind of creator figure to be in this inferior position. And to me, I just started researching to find out why it really is that we've been in this situation. And I know from my my historical research, and I've written about this, it's not that we are an inferior people. It's not that we've been cursed to be oppressed or subjugated, because when you look at our history before colonialism, we produced some of the greatest civilizations in human history. So to me, Pan-Africanism, it started out, as I said, that observation and just trying to figure out why it is that African people around the world are in the conditions that we're in. And I'll add, secondarily, when I really started getting involved in Pan-Africanism, both as a researcher and as an activist, the other thing that I realized is that at its core, Pan-Africanism, it really is about family. When you think about what's been done to us as an African people in terms of the slave trade ripping millions of people from the African continent and dispersing them throughout the Americas, and then you think about what life was like on the slave plantations, with families being broken up, children being taken from the moms and sold to different plantations. And then when you look at what they did to the African continent in terms of going there and drawing up borders, and it created a situation where you might have members of the same family on two different sides of the same border. So as I got more engaged and involved in Pan-Africanism, I started realizing Pan-Africanism isn't only necessary as a political and economic and social movement to address the global oppression of African people. I think on a deeper level, it really is a movement about reconnecting the African family and reconnecting with those bonds that were deliberately destroyed during slavery and colonialism.
Absolutely. That's just I like that you talked about wanting to be a part of or seeing an injustice but not knowing the full picture of the ins and out, but still wanting to be a part of the solution. And then through your studies, that's what led you to Pan-Africanism, and that's something that a lot of people, I think, they can identify with, because most of us don't grow up in Pan-African families. We don't have that in-home training, but those of us that have chosen this as a ideology, now we have that responsibility. We have that responsibility for our children and our families and our offspring, to teach them so they won't come up the hard way like we have. Expose them to different things, and ultimately they'll make the choice for themselves, but they can't say they weren't exposed. They didn't have that experience. We have to provide that experience for them. So I definitely that resonated with me when you talked about that. Tell me, who are some of your influences in the Pan-Africanism movement?
Yeah. Well, I'll add very quickly. I mean, when you talk about being exposed, and what was interesting about my situation is I was exposed to Pan-Africanism subconsciously even before I realized that one of the people who's been a tremendous influence, to me, is Walter Rani, who is a scholar and Pan-African activist from Ghana. And I found out when I was 19 that my mom was actually a part of that movement in Ghana, the Walter Rani movement, when she was a child. So it was interesting to me as I got into Pan-Africanism and just conversations I had with my mom, and realizing that she was part of the Pan-African struggle that was going on in Ghana at the time. So I'd have to say that she was an influence, even though I didn't necessarily get a conscious understanding of Pan-Africanism from her, because she wasn't really conscious of the struggle she was engaged in as well. So definitely get that influence from my household. As I mentioned, Walter Rani has been an influence, particularly as a scholar activist, because one thing that I admire about Walter Rani was he was a very prolific scholar, but his scholarship was always connected to the grassroots struggle of African people, and he had no patience with academics who were completely removed from the struggle. You know, I mean, we still have this issue now where a lot of our academics, they're removed from the struggle, so they write books and give lectures and, you know, engage in those intellectual activities. But what I learned from Walter Rodney was the importance of really engaging in the struggle and using your scholarship to advance the African liberation struggle. Malcolm X, he was, you know, I would credit Malcolm X really with my introduction to Pan-Africanism. The first time I ever heard about Pan-Africanism was through reading some of Malcolm X's speeches. So, you know, he's been an influence. I mean, there's so many people that have influenced me that it's very difficult to really name them all now on the spot, because I would also have to mention John Henry Clark. You know, John Henry Clark was probably the biggest influence for me in terms of, you know, why I became a scholar and a historian of African history. Marcus Garvey, you know, that definitely been a big influence. So you know, those are some of the names that come to my head. But, you know, like I said, I've written 20 books, and during the course of doing the research for those books, I've just come across so many great men and women throughout their history that have been an influence to me in many ways. And to me, that's been the most rewarding aspect of the research and the scholarship that I do, is to be able to, you know, discover these ancestors and to be able to connect with the legacies and the struggles that they were engaged in. And it's also that feeling of realizing that these aren't just ancestors who you know, struggled and died for our liberation, but they're alive with us today. And I think it's our responsibility to continue the legacies of these people.
Absolutely. So two things that I just learned that we have in common. I want to first say, if you guys don't know who Walter Rodney is, go pick up the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It's a great text. But what I learned about you just now is we both have a figure in the Pan-African movement that affected our parents. And I didn't know this for years either, but I was born in California. My mother was an educator. My mother is a teacher. She's a speech pathologist, to be exact. Apparently, there was a time in California where it was really hard for teachers to get jobs. You know, we're from the SoCal area, LA area. So Asa Hilliard was the one who told my mother to move down south where the jobs were. And I didn't know this until probably I was about 25, 26 when I was reading a book by Asa Hilliard. And, you know, she asked me what I was reading. I told her what I was reading. She said, I sure do miss him. I said, what do you mean you miss him? You never told me you knew Asa Hilliard. And you know, then she tells me the story. And I was like, wow. So, you know, subconsciously I was exposed to a few things as well. Just through that interaction, you know. And the other thing I just learned, which is probably a lot of people in the struggle or in the movement, John Henry Clark, big influence on me. You know, John Henry Clark, the godfather for me. He's just one of those imposing figures, you know, doesn't get loud, doesn't get, you know, amped up like some of our other scholars, but cool, calm delivery, and just daggers, just spears, just you know, he's in my mind, you know, him and Sheikh Anta Diop, like epitome of scholarship when I think about them. You know what I'm saying? Those are two guys that come to mind that I'm like, you know, these guys are polished. They're pros at what they do. So I definitely concur with what you're saying there. I see some people in the chat speaking some of my father's language, speaking some Wolof, Nangadef, Nag, Naim Def, Jamninga, Fayani. So, you know, I got to speak some to my folks, so my Imboka, my family. Appreciate you all for coming out. Like, share, subscribe to the channel. We're going to continue, you know, with the interview. Let somebody know about what's going on, because this is a powerful brother. We got to really, you know, get our authors and scholars more publicity, more exposure, because as we all know, there's the charlatans are among us, preying on our our ignorance and our inability to go the extra mile and study. So the ones that do, we got to push them to the forefront, and this is why I do interviews with qualified people. But speaking of information, let's talk about some of your books. And I know you got a lot of them, but give me your three favorite books and talk about them briefly to the audience.
Three favorites. I I know off the top of my head, one that I would definitely say would be up there, and actually have it right here. Four Must Go, and the reason why this one is particularly special to me is that most of what I've written is from a historical context. Four Must Go is actually about an ongoing struggle right now, the struggle in Togo to liberate Togo from 5 decades of dictatorship, and that's a struggle I've been involved in. So that book definitely has a special place to me, just because, as I said, it's a current ongoing struggle, and it's a struggle that I've been involved in and assisted with in a number of ways. I would say definitely would have to put Malcolm X, Bob Marley, and other essays up there as well, just because it's one of the larger books that I've written, and I published it very early in my phase of writing and publishing, and I think it probably my most read paperback book. And to me, that book really sums up what I tried to do as a Pan African researcher, because that book, it covers so many different topics throughout the African diaspora and throughout the African continent, in terms of just the different struggles that we've engaged in, and the different people that have contributed. So in that book, I have essays on Malcolm X, Kwame Nkrumah, Bob Marley, and the Rastafari movement in the Caribbean. There's an essay in there as well on the Black Power movement in Trinidad, when Eric Williams was Prime Minister of Trinidad, and that essay really it covers the fact that even though Trinidad became independent from British colonialism, the colonial system was still in place. And what that Black Power movement was about was Black people in Trinidad recognizing that even though we have political independence, we're not truly independent. So that was a whole movement to try to liberate Trinidad and really implement a meaningful independence. So I'm gonna have to think really hard here what the number three book that would be on that list, but I don't know. I would probably say the political intellectual legacy of Walter Rodney, just because, as I said, I have a very personal connection with Walter Rodney. So the book is meaningful to me on that level. That, as I said, my mom was part of that movement in Guyana. So there's a personal connection, but also that book is meaningful to me in the level that Walter Rodney, considering how profound his impact has been on the Pan African struggle, I don't think he gets nearly the amount of attention that he deserves. So, for me, the inspiration for writing that book was just to put together a comprehensive view of who Walter Rodney was and what his contributions to both our political struggle and the intellectual struggle that we are engaged in as a people were.
Absolutely, you got to give people their flowers, while they're here. Walter Rodney has been, putting in a lot of work, so it's great that you gave a text to, explore some of his intellectual, accomplishments and his point of view. I don't know if he's aware of the book or not, but I'm sure if he's been made aware, I'm sure he appreciates it, because even though we're writers, we're scholars, people are going to write about us as well. I tell people, when you become a writer, you become amongst what I call the immortals, because people can look at your information thousands of years later and say, oh, this is what Brother Omowale Wong was talking about. Oh, this is his point of view to our struggle. This is what he was trying to say about Togo, and that's something that doesn't go away. We've been talking about the Egyptians. They've been gone for 5,000 plus years. We've been talking about these other African cultures, the Nsibi script, the Vais script, all of these writing systems, and they were established so long ago. So it's no different with us today. We're still talking about John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, Chancellor Williams, John G. Jackson. The list goes on and on. Our great giants who put out material, they're going to live forever through our hearts and minds and our reading about them. So when you become that author, you become a part of an exclusive club, and that's what I call basically the showcase of the immortals, because long after we're returned from whence we came, it's still going to be, our work's still going to be out there. So, you know, your books are amazing. I salute you on that. And I'm glad that you didn't mention certain books, because I'm going to ask you about those later. But quickly, tell the people where they can get your material.
All of my materials available on Amazon, both as paperback, and I have different Kindle, what they call Kindle singles. So those are short essays. Some of them are 20 to 30 pages that can be downloaded on Kindle, but yeah, everything is available on Amazon. I think Barnes and Noble as well. I have to go back and double check, but I think Barnes and Noble also they sell all of my paperback online.
Absolutely, absolutely. So y'all go support the brother on Amazon, and pick up some topics that interest you. He got 20 books. I know something gonna interest you. Pick up something. Support Black authors. In your eyes, who are some of our best leaders to come out of Africa?
Were you talking about the post-colonial period?
Correct.
Okay, so definitely I'd have to put Thomas Sankara as number one, and I've written a chapter on him in one of my books. I think just what he was able to accomplish within 4 years in terms of getting his country more towards self-reliance and self-sufficiency, producing and growing their own food, clothing. I remember he used to brag about how all the clothing that he wore was produced in Burkina Faso, and I think that's especially important because something that Africa has really struggled with after independence has been, self-reliance and self-sufficiency. And when you look at, just the resources that Africa has, there's no reason why any African country should be as dependent as they have been. So I think he's definitely number one to me for that reason and for many other reasons. Kwame Nkrumah as well. I think he definitely would have to be up there just because his vision and his passion for African liberation and unity is so powerful that I think Kwame Nkrumah was really, he really set the standard for what we look for in terms of African leaders. And I know, for me as a scholar and a researcher, I certainly look to Nkrumah as a standard, not only in terms of, his vision for Pan-Africanism and his struggle against imperialism and colonialism, but also, I wrote an essay on him, and I also looked at some of his, faults as well. So for me, Nkrumah was that figure who not only had a great vision for Africa, but also he made, certain mistakes and errors, which I think are very important to study to improve upon. Because, as I mentioned, one of the struggles that Africa is currently engaged in is this issue of dependency and relying on foreign powers to develop our countries. And I think Kwame Nkrumah, that was one of the mistakes he made, trying to rely too much on Britain and America and other colonial powers to come in and develop his nation. So, for me, Nkrumah is the standard, both for the great things he did and also how, things that we can learn from in terms of the mistakes he's made. Julius Nyerere, I put him in the same category as well as another leader who had a very great vision for his country, but also made certain errors as well that we should, study and learn from. Because when I study certain leaders and write about them, I don't only look at the achievements and the great things they did, but also what were the setbacks, what are the mistakes they made that we can learn from and build from, and also understanding the context of what they were struggling against. Because I think we kind of take it for granted now that Africa's been independent for a while, but when you really think about what it's like to take over a newly independent a nation that had been colonized and underdeveloped, how do you go about developing a nation in that context, especially dealing with the pressures of neocolonialism that we know Kwame Nkrumah and other leaders have dealt with. So, I say that to make the point that, as I'm assessing these leaders, I'm very well aware that mistakes are going to happen simply because of just the obstacles and the pressures that certain leaders have faced. And I think that's been the struggles that Africa has been dealing with since independence. Is the fact that not only has Africa produced, just very awful leaders in terms of just, the corruption and the human rights abuses, and obviously, the government of Togo has been a regime like that. It's been very awful in terms of what it's been doing to the Togolese people. And as I said, that's a struggle I've been involved in. But I don't not only look at African leadership in that context, but also understanding that when Africa became independent, it wasn't, African leaders did not have an easy task. And I've written about Patrice Lumumba, who's another African leader that I admire. And when you look at his history, he had no background whatsoever in terms of politics, in terms of managing a country. So that was a situation in the Congo where Lumumba, who had no prior political experience, is now having to take over a country like the Congo, and dealing with tribalism, dealing with colonial underdevelopment, dealing with pressure from Belgium and the United States and other international entities. So I mentioned this to make the point that when we talk about leadership on the African continent, I think it's important to understand that leaders on the continent face a lot of pressures. Even Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, who's someone I've been very critical of for many reasons, we have to understand that when he started moving in a more independent direction and trying to establish policies in this country, which he thought were more beneficial for the people of Zimbabwe, United States, Britain, and other powers put sanctions on him. So it's very difficult to properly assess leadership in Africa, simply for the fact that very few of our leaders have really had the freedom to implement policies, because when they implement policies which are unpopular among Western countries, they have to deal with those pressures in terms of sanctions, coup attempts, assassination attempts. So that's something that I factor in as well when I look at leadership on the continent, just the type of struggles that our leaders have had to endure. So I think, as I said before, I tend to be very critical of African leaders, and try to understand how we can build and learn from the mistakes they've made, but also with an understanding of it's not easy. We still have to deal with these neo-colonial pressures and foreign influences.
I too am very critical of African leaders because I know where we have to go. And my father was born in Gambia, so those of us that are familiar with Yahya Jammeh and the regime that ended, a lot of us in America just don't know, what some of our African leaders are doing to the continent. Um, if you talk to the average person who even knows who Yahya Jammeh is in America, they'll say, "Oh man, he seems like a great leader." Because he took a stand against homosexuality, and he talks good in interviews. But if you talk to the people in Gambia, they're like, this guy's awful, And I was one of those people at one point. I don't want to make it seem like, I'm like, I was always plugged in or not. But when I start talking to my family about some of the things he would do, I was horrified. And, one thing we don't know is, African leaders, they have the power to censor people over there. And they use guerrilla tactics, and people have come up missing, and people have ended up dead, and we don't never hear about it in America, and it's a reason for that. Even someone like Robert Mugabe. Everybody loves Robert Mugabe because of he stands up to the Western powers and everything like that, but we don't really do the history on the things that he did for his country, and the things that he's done to other political opponents, and the farms, and it's a whole history that we're just so ignorant to on this side of the water, unless you really 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 get into their newspapers and their media, and it's just a whole world we're not exposed to. But we got to do that research. So I agree with you there. Very critical of African leaders. Corruption is crippling Africa. It's just that's just what it is. Uh, Corruption is something that we're gonna have to deal with if we ever want to be you know move towards freedom and sovereignty. We have to deal with the corruption. But you named some great leaders. Thomas Sankara, as Brother Kofi just did a presentation about him recently. But I know this was after Thomas Sankara's time, but he's an honorary Masi member in my eyes. I know the empire was long gone, by the time he came around, but we recognize him as an honorary Masi warrior because I think he would have been a great fit in that time. Just with his mindset, he had like a Pan-African mind state, before it was really cool to say or anything like that. He was like, do for self, let's become self-sufficient. And I appreciate that about him. You mentioned Julius Nyerere. If people don't know who he is, brother out of Tanzania, look him up and the struggles that he went through for his land. Great African leader. In fact, there's something named after him amongst the UNIA in Atlanta. I'm trying to remember what exactly it is, but they've incorporated his name amongst the UNIA in Division 421 in Atlanta. Most of you should be familiar with Patrice Lumumba out of the Congo and, the conflict with them and Mobutu. And, of course, Kwame Nkrumah, probably the most famous of all of them. But like you said, we have to learn from our leaders' mistakes, too. I definitely agree with that. But I want to ask you about some people that you did name. What about Steve Biko?
Steve Biko. Now, when you said leaders, my head went to political leaders, people who actually held political power, and
Yeah, I get you.
yeah, I was never in that position. But I mean, the first thing I think of with Steve Biko is just the fact that in the 1970s, he was warning about what we see right now in South Africa. He had that famous warning about we need to change the whole system. We can't just change the face of the people who are in power. Otherwise, we're going to have the same system. And that's exactly what happened in South Africa. Apartheid ended. And essentially what happened was the same system was kept in place, but instead of having, white people in positions of political power, the African National Congress took over. So you had the ANC and you had African leaders, but till this day in South Africa, we see the same capitalist system that is ruthlessly exploiting the African workers there. And Steve Biko was really ahead of his time in terms of understanding that the struggle in South Africa is not just a struggle to replace white oppressors or black oppressors. It's a struggle to replace the entire system that apartheid was built on. I think Steve Biko definitely someone who doesn't get the recognition that he deserves. And I think unfortunately with South Africa, Nelson Mandela has become such an iconic a person within a struggle to the point where I think in many cases he's become more of a symbol. Like people know more of the symbol of Mandela than even the man himself, and I think his legacy tends to overshadow the legacy of so many others who were engaged in that struggle as well. I think Steve Biko definitely is one of those who deserves more recognition because much of what he was saying is actually, I think, more relevant today than it was even then because we've seen the benefit of hindsight, how things played out in South Africa after apartheid ended, and Steve Biko was someone who, recognized those concerns very early on.
Absolutely, man. I visited South Africa with my family. Went to the Apartheid Museum. Went to Walter Sisulu's Gardens, who was a mentor of Nelson Mandela. Went pretty much all over, man. Went to so many sites where they call the cradle of humankind, where they have some of the oldest hominids there in South Africa. And I didn't see Steve Biko anywhere. Except for on he was kind of graffitied in a South African village where Nelson Mandela is from, Soweto. He was graffitied there, but that's the only place I saw him. Like I didn't see him you know, in the apartheid museum. But like you said, Nelson is such a dominating figure. Like, he overshadows everybody. Like, the mall is named Nelson Mandela Square. You know, like they got a big bronze statue, probably, you know, 20 feet in the air of Nelson Mandela there. So, you know, he's such a dominating figure, that, yeah, he kind of overshadows other great people of South Africa. But they do have an exhibit called A Long Walk to Freedom. That's a ways out from the city of Johannesburg, that they give homage to basically every single person that fought for freedom from the time before Shaka and up to Nelson Mandela. So you will find a lot of people, and they're all statues. They're all bronze statues. So you'll see these statues immortalized. So they do give homage to him there. But as far as in the museums and things like that, you won't see him as much as you see Nelson Mandela, unfortunately. What about Emil Cabral?
Yeah, he's another one that I think is very underappreciated in terms of just what he was able to accomplish in building an anti-colonial struggle against the Portuguese. And where Cabral really stands out to me is the political theory that he established. His ability to study and understand the history of his people and to incorporate that into the anti-colonial struggle against Portugal. And I think that, and I mentioned that earlier with Walter Ronnie, that ability to not only just study history, but also to utilize history in the service of the African liberation struggle. And I think Cabral did that. When you read his writings, he had a very detailed understanding of the history of his people in pre-colonial times. He wrote about and spoke about certain political and social structures in Africa, pre-colonial African society. And I think where Cabral excelled is he was able to recognize in pre-colonial times certain structures and certain traditions which were beneficial to the African struggle. He was able to utilize, but at the same time, he was also very critical of pre-colonial society as well. So certain things that he felt weren't necessarily beneficial to the struggle, he did not incorporate. I think that's important for us now, because we've been robbed of so much of our history, and so much of what we've been given in terms of history has been a distortion. We've been indoctrinated to believe that before Europeans came to civilize us, we were just savages and cannibals wearing rungjunkels, wearing loincloths, running after zebras with spears. Like, it's just a very negative image, and I think we need to avoid the tendency of over romanticizing our history in response to that negative image. So one of the things that stands out to me about Cabral is his ability to rehabilitate African history in a way that was useful and not necessarily overly romantic about what had existed prior. And yeah, as I said, I think he's definitely underappreciated in the history of the anti-colonial struggle, and he led for those who don't know, he led one of the armed struggles against the Portuguese in Africa, because Portugal had decided that they weren't going to give up the colonies without a fight, and Cabral was one of those people who led that struggle. And what I would mention about Cabral as well, which I think is very, very important because it really demonstrates the type of commitment that he had to African people, is that he didn't need to be involved in the struggle. He was what the Portuguese had called an assimilated African. He had went to Portugal, had studied in Portugal, had married a Portuguese woman. So he was as assimilated into the Portuguese colonial system as an African could have been. And Cabral could have been content with just being assimilated and trying to live the best life he could under the Portuguese colonial system. But he decided to take up arms and wage a struggle for liberation for his people. And to me, that's always important when I look at history, to find individuals who could have lived a decent life, could have lived a comfortable life, and decided that it wasn't just enough for them to, as an individual, have a comfortable life. They wanted to fight for the liberation of their people, and in many cases it required self-sacrifice. I think that that's something that I always appreciate and admire when I see that in certain historical people who didn't necessarily even need to be involved in the struggle, but did so anyways, just out of a commitment to our people.
Absolutely. For those that don't know, Brother Cabral out of Guinea-Bissau, Go research him. I'm mentioning all these people and where they're from for a reason. So for those that are not familiar, you can go research them and learn more about them. Even if you just read, like their Wikipedia page, like learn some more about them. And the final person that I want to ask you about, a brother that people say I look like this guy, and that is Samora Michael out of
Uh,
Mozambique.
yeah. Um, yeah. To be honest, I haven't really studied him as closely because when I think of the struggle in Portuguese colonialism, Cabral is the first one that the main one I think of. But yeah, Samora
Yeah.
Machel, he definitely was one of the leading figures in the anti-colonial struggle in Portugal and also in the Pan-African struggle on the continent. And part of the reason why it's very difficult for me to really assess who he was as a leader, his legacy, it goes back to the same thing that I was talking about. That when Mozambique became independent, it was very shortly after there was a civil war that broke out in the country that was backed by South Africa and other neo-colonial forces on the continent. So that's a great example of what I was talking about in terms of it's very difficult to really assess his legacy because he didn't have the freedom or the ability to develop his country after colonialism had ended because he was just dealing with so many other external pressures. So yeah, and it's very difficult for me to properly assess his legacy as a leader because there were so many mistakes and issues that were made in Mozambique, but at the same time, I recognize that there wasn't that freedom to really develop Mozambique or to pursue an independent policy just because we were dealing with a civil war that was very destructive to the country. And I don't think Mozambique still up to this day has really fully recovered from that civil war. But Samora Machel definitely stands out as one of the leading anti-colonial figures and Pan-African leaders of his day.
Yeah, I mean, the Rhodesian, what they refer to as the Rhodesian Bush War, and then they have the Civil War, and so like you said, he was fighting. They were fighting for a long time, and unfortunately, he died in that plane crash.
Yeah, that
That
was a lot
a
of
lot
people
of people.
think it's assassination, but we don't know.
Yeah, we don't. A lot of that, and you were going right where I was going. A lot of people think the Portuguese had something to do with that, and they may well could have, but we don't know. We don't have no hard evidence, but it's unfortunate that he passed in that manner. So Kofi said that's my brother. They, you know, and I found out that we favor each other by accident. I posted a article about him, and people thought the article was about me. Until they clicked on it and they were like, why do you look like him? I was like, do I? And then I started looking at his pictures. I was like, yeah, I see the resemblance. So much peace be upon him.
Like I said, Pan-Africanism is my family.
Yeah, like I guess I don't have any Mozambique connections that I know of, but
Right.
yeah, maybe migration or something. I don't know. But you're in law school, correct?
Yes.
So, what are your aspirations in that field? You want to be a lawyer, a judge, or?
I'm still trying to figure that out because one of the things that being in law school is really opened my eyes to is just how corrupt the judicial system really is, and the fact that a lawyer working within the system really has not much ability to really change the system from the
Right.
inside. One of the books that I published recently called "Illegally Created People," it deals with the fact that when you look at the struggles of African people, most of the political changes, the legal changes that we've made have actually come through violating, these laws. One of the examples I gave was Harriet
Mm-hmm.
Tubman, who actually used to go to slave plantations to liberate enslaved Africans, and that was illegal at the time. Or, I mentioned the situation that we spoke about before in South Africa, how so many of the people who were engaged in the anti-apartheid struggle, including Nelson Mandela, were lawyers, and they came to the conclusion that creating change just not going to be done through the courtroom. Creating change is going to have to be done through political mobilization, armed struggle. So that's one of the things I've been really dealing with in law school, is just looking at the structure of the legal system and realizing one of the ways that a colonial system, an oppressive colonial system, upholds itself is by making resistance illegal. And we spoke about Togo a bit, and I wrote about Togo in that book as well, about how, and this is true of other African dictatorships, but how in Togo, how certain things become illegal. For example, as you mentioned before, African governments control the press, so they create a situation where if you write anything negative or critical of the government, they can legally go in there and arrest you and throw you in prison and torture you and do all kinds of horrible things, which technically are legal because these are the people who are in power, and once you have power, you dictate what's legal and what's illegal. So law schools really definitely opened my eyes up to just how systemic racism in the United States is, because there's a legal basis for a lot of these things. Another thing that's really opened my eyes up to, as well as the importance of nationalism, because in my book Illegally Created People, there's a chapter comparing the African American struggle for reparations with the Native American situation. And one of the things that I had never thought about is the fact that Native Americans were able to enter into treaties with the United States, and that kind of gives them more of a legal basis for their claims. So I've written about cases where Native Americans were able to prevail on these claims because there was a legal binding treaty which was broken. And then when you look at the African American situation, because African people in the United States have never been regarded as being a nation within a nation the same way Native Americans were, and as such, they were never able to enter into treaties with the United States because treaties are between two legally recognized nations, and African people in the U.S. have always been men enslaved, oppressed,
Right.
people who were regarded as second-class citizens, and because there was no nationhood recognition, there was never an ability to enter into treaties. So, you're one of the things that that opened my eyes to that I never thought about is just the fact that having a nation isn't only important in terms of a political or economic context, but also even just legal recognition. That comes with being a nation that African people in the United States don't have, that Native Americans have had the advantage of. So yeah, so to answer your question, I'm not quite sure about being a lawyer, but I definitely plan to find ways to utilize all the legal knowledge that I've acquired in law school, because these are things that I had never really thought about to um to that level. And I think I know there's a lot of people who never really looked at or understood the legal aspects and the legal considerations in the struggle. So I wrote a book in it, and moving forward, I definitely hope to do what I can to educate more people on the legal aspect of the struggles as well.
We need more people. I know it's a tough thing to do. Because of your Pan African ideology, going into those arenas and reading some of this stuff, like, are they serious? Like, like, I know, but we do need people on that side of the law. It just even if it's giving counsel to young brothers about how the law will treat them if they enter into certain arenas, where there's no safety net, or how the law can be very cold and callous towards African Americans. So we do need people in that legal field, because, like you said, most of the advancements that we have come by breaking these rules, breaking these laws. So we're gonna need some lawyers, or some judges or somebody on the team, to try to help us out. And that's just what resistance is. I don't think people really understand that that's what we've done historically, from even before we got on these shores, revolting resistance. You can make an argument that places like Jamaica were built on resistance. Places like Haiti built on resistance. Guyana built on resistance. So that's just what African people do when stuff ain't going their way. They gonna revolt in some manner. It's coming. We only gonna take but so much. So we need people on that side of the law, to let us know what's up, and we plan our actions accordingly based off that information. But I saw that you had a hand in renaming a middle school. Could you
Yeah,
talk to us about that?
yeah, that's Stonewall Jackson Middle School that's located right here in Orlando, and my role in that effort is we had a meeting, and we were discussing renaming the school because there's no reason why any black child should be going to school named after a slave owner. So in the meeting, we came up with the idea to replace the name with Roberto Clemente, who's a famous Puerto Rican baseball player. So I went before the school board and gave a speech presenting why I think the school should be renamed to Roberto Clemente. And um, I'd entered law school shortly after giving the speech, so I wasn't as actively engaged in the movement after. But apparently the speech I gave definitely resonated with those who were still in the effort to rename the school. And as it turns out, the school was renamed, and it was renamed after Roberto Clemente, which was the name I'd selected when I spoke before the school board.
That's
Uh,
awesome, man. That's real effective change. It's crazy. You got to go in front of a board and tell them about how racist a racist was. Like, they
yeah,
don't know that Stonewall Jackson was a racist. Like, you guys knew that before I came up here, or you should have known that. Same thing with Gandhi, with our brother Obadele Kambone had to deal with in Ghana. Like, why do I have to tell you people how racist this guy was? Like, why don't you know? Why didn't anybody do the research before they named or put this statue, these things here? Like, you can't tell me nobody knew. But
yeah,
those are our battles to fight. So I understand.
yeah, but that was a great experience because I was at the school recently because a mural was painted in honor of Roberto Clemente. So I was able to go there and met two of his sons. I met his grandson. And it was a great experience for me just being on the school and looking at the big mural of Roberto Clemente, thinking that when I went to school, I went to a Catholic school. So when I went to school, all of the images were white Jesus, white Mary, white angels. So I never really had the experience of being able to step onto school and see a big mural of a black man that represents me. So to me, it was a very profound experience to actually be able to step onto the school campus and to see Roberto Clemente's name all over the campus and go to the mural. And, think about the fact that black children who used to go to our school were going to school named after a man who used to own their ancestors. Now they're going to school named after a man who looks like them, and they see that big mural of Roberto Clemente. And I think it's very important for black children to be able to go to school in an environment where they feel represented. They don't have to feel like I'm going to school named after a slave owner and reading curriculum that's based on slave owners. I remember growing up in school, my experience learning about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and these slave owners, and I remember thinking, this history doesn't mean the same thing to me as it does to the white teacher, teaching us this and the white students.
Right. It's the connect is not there. So I definitely understand that. Legendary baseball player Roberto Clemente. Did he die in a plane crash as well?
Yeah, he died in a plane crash.
Man. Peace to the ancestor. So as far as we study the continent, we study its political, climates and stuff like that. Give me 3 repatriation destinations that you would consider.
Really? The funny thing about that is I think most people, repatriation destination that they think of is Ghana. And if you were to ask me, several years ago, I would probably say Ghana. Honestly, I would put Togo up there as number one for me, just because I've been so actively engaged in the struggle in Togo, and I've gotten to know some of the activists. What I've realized from contacting these activists and engaged in with them, and it's even mentioned here in this book. The plans that some of these activists have is that once Togo is liberated from the neo-colonial dictatorship that's there, some of the activists actually want to make Togo a destination, almost like what Haiti was. Haiti became a safe haven for any African in diaspora or
Mm-hmm.
anywhere in the world. Haiti had the policy in the constitution that said if you're of African ancestry, regardless of where you're born, you could come to Haiti and be a Haitian citizen.
Mm.
Some of the brothers and sisters in Togo, they have the same vision for Togo. They want Togo to be a place where, regardless of where you're from in the world, as long as you have African blood, African ancestry, if you come to Togo, you're a Togolese citizen. So I think, for me, that definitely puts Togo number one on the list, just because I've been so involved in the struggle to liberate Togo, and for me, the end vision of what a liberated Togo looks like is a Togo that is a Pan African hub. It's a place where African people around the world could travel to. Obviously, Togo being a French-speaking country, there's going to be a bit of a language barrier. I don't speak French, but yeah, definitely Togo. Ghana would be up there as well. Number three, I don't know. I would say Nigeria, but the thing about being a Pan African is I get so much love from brothers and sisters on the continent that I've gotten messages from brothers and sisters in Ghana saying I need to come back home and visit Ghana. I need to come back home to Nigeria, Sierra Leone. I was told recently I need to come by and visit Senegal. So repatriation has kind of always been one of those things that I've never really had a singular destination, because I always understand I've yet to visit the continent. I'm hoping to do so this year, but I've always understood that I would be welcome regardless of where I went on the continent, because, like I said, just that connection and that bond between African people, I think, is so strong. So in terms of repatriation, as I said, I've never really sat down and thought about a single destination, but if I had to, I would definitely say Togo, Ghana, and perhaps Nigeria at the top three.
I've been to Senegal myself. I had a great time in Senegal, but I will say, and this is probably the case in Togo too, you got to brush up on your Francais.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, man, it's so humbling to be around somebody. I mean, to be in a country that nobody speak English, like, or very few people, speak English. And luckily, my niece lives in Senegal, so she was able to communicate for us. And then we found a tour guide that did speak English when we went to Gorée Island, but that was about it. Everybody else was either Wolof or Francais. So I always take that into account. For me, definitely Ghana, Gambia for me, because they do speak English.
Yep.
I'm gonna say one that people probably haven't thought about, and that's Johannesburg. They do speak English, and it's not as much of a transition for some people because they are very modern. And it's just so educational there as far as, the history, and they don't exactly trash, the spiritual traditions. They have the Lesedi village, they have Sangomas, they have that. So, I think that's a destination more people could be comfortable at. It's a lot in South Africa. I was shocked because I was trying to go to Nigeria, but Nigeria, I was taking my whole family, so it was a bit expensive. So we switched it to Johannesburg like at the last minute, and man, it was a wonderful, wonderful trip. They got a lot of things there. Now, I gotta ask you this: why did you decide to write a book on Pan-Asianism?
Because I feel like as a Pan Africanist, it's not just enough to study our own the history of our own movement. We also need to study other Pan movements. I think Pan Africanists often, I think, take it for granted that there are other Pan movements out there. Pan Africanism isn't the only movement. So I started studying Pan-Asianism just to see what kind of lessons can we draw as Pan Africanists from studying another Pan movement, particularly the Pan-Asian movement, because we don't hear a lot about Pan-Asianism now because that movement had essentially failed. So, for me, studying Pan-Asianism was just a lesson studying why is it that Pan-Asianism failed, and why is it Pan-Africanism as a pan movement has persisted as long as it has? And when I was looking at the history of Pan-Asianism, some of the lessons I drew was, first of all, there was a lot of internal conflict among the Asian countries. Pan-Asianism was a response to Western imperialism in Asia. Asian countries recognized that they needed to unify to resist Western imperialism, but beyond that, there was really no basis for these countries to unite. They understood that they shared a common enemy, but there was no shared interest. And Pan-Asianism took place during the era of the world wars, and as we know, Japan had aspirations to be an imperial power of its own during World War. One of the things that Japan did was actually, annexed Korea, had annexed part of China. So Japan had aspirations to be an imperial power as well, and that created a lot of friction within the Pan-Asian movement, because Pan-Asianism for Japan was a justification for Japanese imperialism. It was a vision of, we want a united Asia, but it was united Asia under Japanese domination. And obviously, Koreans and Chinese and other people who were subjected to Japanese imperialism had felt differently. So when I was looking at that, it made me understand the importance of building a pan movement that doesn't place one group or the interest of one group above another. And the other thing that I thought about as well, and I mentioned this before about Pan-Africanism actually being rooted in family. As I said, when you look at the history of African people, we're one people that have been scattered throughout the world. We've been separated by colonial borders and those kind of things. And when you look at Asia never really went through that same history of being scattered and having borders drawn up. So a lot of the Asian countries still held on to its national identities. The Chinese were still very nationalistic. Japanese were still very nationalistic. And what studying Pan-Asianism made me realize is that as African people, we really can't be nationalistic, because, as I said, I was born in Ghana. The reason why I was born there is because my ancestors were taken from Africa, dropped off in Ghana, and Ghana was colonized by the British. So I was born in the former British Ghana, which was different than Dutch Ghana and French Ghana, which were Dutch and French colonies. So some Africans were taken to Jamaica, some were taken to Haiti, some were taken to Brazil or the US. And then when you look at the African continent and you just look at all the borders that have been drawn up. So when we talk about African nations today, we're not really talking about African nations that were the products of Africa's own political and social development. We're talking about things that were created by colonialism. So when I looked at Pan-Asianism and I compared it to Pan-Africanism, one of the things that I realized is that Asians are still nationalistic, because those were nations that Asian people themselves had created to some extent. China was the creation of China was a whole historical process that involved various different ethnic groups being incorporated into what we think of as China, but it was not something that was imposed on Chinese people by outsiders. And when you look at African people and just the nationalities that we claim, most of these nationalities were things that have been imposed on us. And studying Pan-Asianism made me realize that how African people think about nationality and nationalism is very different from other groups. And I think that's one of the elements that's made Pan-Africanism a much stronger movement than Pan-Asianism, and it's made it so long-lasting, to the point where, as I said, Pan-Asianism, I don't really see much talk about Pan-Asianism. It's certainly not a priority among the leaders of Asia. And then Pan-Africanism, the pulse of Pan-Africanism is so strong that even though I don't think most African leaders on the continent are serious about Pan-Africanism, we still have institutions such as the African Union, or even regional institutions such as ECOWAS, which demonstrate that African leaders, even if it's lip service, they still recognize that African unification is important enough that they're willing to pay lip service to this unification. And we see it even in the diaspora. A lot of Caribbean countries over the last few years have been making more of an effort to connect with Africa. So I don't think the Pan-African movement is as strong as it could be or as it should be. But one of the things I took away from studying Pan-Asianism is just the fact that Pan-Africanism has really been such a strong force in the lives of African people. It's not only a political force, it's been a social, economic force. And the same can be said for Pan-Asianism, because of the different historical struggles that Asian people have had to endure compared to African people.
Amos Wilson always says, as long as you have African Centered Foundation, you can take, we can learn from almost anything, so that I take that approach in my studies as well. And John Henry Clark talked about studying your European history as well. So it's important we look at these other movements, because we can look at, we can possibly mitigate mistakes, from other people as well. In my correct me if I'm wrong, but the China and Japanese thing kind of killed Pan Asianism.
Yeah, that if I would have to point to one thing that killed Pan-Asianism, it would be that thing.
Yeah, that's what I kind of got from reading about it. I was like, yeah, those two kind of they wasn't gonna get along.
But more so from the Japanese perspective, because as I said, at the time, Japan was kind of taking the approach of trying to be an imperial power, just like Europe was. And the feeling among the Pan-Asianists in China was, this whole building a civilization on imperialism and conquest and colonialism, that was viewed as kind of like a Western thing. So the feeling among a lot of Chinese was Japan had become Europeanized. They had no longer they had rejected Asian culture and were essentially adopting the ways of Western civilization, which is a civilization based on conquest and plunder. So it was very interesting to see that conflict between the Pan-Asianists in China and those in Japan. And as I said, the view of the Chinese was that imperialism and conquest isn't the Asian way. It was essentially the view that some of the Chinese had, and the Japanese, their view was, we want to unite Asia, and Japan is going to be the force that's going to unite Asia, whether or not China, Korea, and the rest of the Asian countries want it or not.
Yeah, that's but we can learn from that. Like a brother just said it in the chat. When you go against your tradition and you become an assimilate into another culture, it's going to be issues. It's going to be problems.
We know that from our own history.
Say again.
No, I mean we know that from our own history, just in terms of all the problems that we see across the African continent. I think could be mitigated or just eliminated by going back to our own tradition.
Absolutely. And I'm a big advocate of that. Being a Inisheshe practitioner from the Yoruba people, we could mitigate so many problems by looking within the wisdom within our own creation versus outsourcing and looking at other people's like it's better than ours. And then it starts to take on a social, political, context of, we're backwards, and like the stuff you were speaking about earlier. So
and I could
definitely
actually
I agree with you.
Example of that, the civil war in Uganda after the war had
Yep.
ended. Ugandans were wrestling with how do we address the war crimes and everything that happened, and they realized the Western system of justice really isn't adequate because it's a system based on punishment. So,
Mm-hmm.
what they did in Uganda was adopt a more traditional justice system, which was not so much based on punishment but reconciliation. And they realized after going through such a bloody and destructive civil war, what you needed was reconciliation and rebuilding that sense
Right.
of community. So, to me, I always use that as an example of how we can apply traditional African practices in a very practical manner to address some of the issues that we're dealing with, because a lot of European concepts really aren't suited for what African people are dealing with.
Absolutely. That's a great example. And I try to tell people that in most instances in Africa, when you're dealing with traditional culture, there's a path to redemption in some manner. It might take time, but that is what I see in a lot of African cultures, that is I won't say never, but in rare instances it's something like final, like there is a path to getting back on the right track, and it's up to those people at that point to walk that path if they want reconciliation. But let's talk about money and the movement, because that's a hot topic right now. I saw you post some stuff about it. What are your thoughts about money and our struggle for freedom, basically?
Yeah, that's a difficult topic because obviously we live in a capitalist world where you need money just to survive.
Yep.
And if you're an activist or someone involved in the struggle, you very quickly learn that you're going to be limited in a lot of ways if you don't have the money to really carry out the kind of things that you need to do for the community. So I think there needs to be a balance in terms of recognizing that just because of the world that we live in, you need money to survive, you need money to accomplish anything. But at the same time, I think there's a trap that some of us fall into where we compromise too much to earn money, or we might sell out more than we should to earn money. I think that's something that we definitely see as an issue within the struggle. Certain activists feeling like I need more money to accomplish things that I want to accomplish, or maybe perhaps needing more money to live comfortably because it's much easier being an activist when you don't have to worry about paying bills and going to work and all of that.
Absolutely.
So I understand it from that perspective, but as I said, it always raises the concern of what are you doing to get the money, and if getting that money is
Hmm.
compromising too much or selling out too much, it kind of reaches a point where it then becomes counterproductive. And yeah,
Hmm.
I mean Kuma before, and I'll mention him here again, where so much of his developmental programs in Ghana were getting foreign assistance from other countries such as the United States and Britain, or even going to institutions such as the IMF or the World Bank to get loans. The problem he quickly ran into was that if so much of your developmental programs are being financed by people on the outside, those same people who are financing you then now have the ability to control you because they're controlling
Hmm.
the money. So what the United States started doing was leveraging a lot of the foreign aid that they were giving to Nkrumah to try to influence his policy. So as I said, it's a balance in understanding that yes, we do need money to accomplish the things that we need to accomplish, but also being very cautious and careful about where you're accepting money from. You know,
Hmm.
what are, um, what are the conditions that are attached to whatever money you're receiving? And I think the other reality that we have to deal with as well within the African struggle. A lot of people get into the struggle just for the opportunities, the opportunity to get involved in the African struggle and to make some money. So
Yeah.
they get involved, struggle to the point where they're often, that's why I mentioned before about Cabral and individuals who could have been well off that sacrificed that comfortable life to struggle for African people. The
Hmm.
opposite side of that is, as I said, opportunists who get involved in the struggle to advance themselves as individuals. And it's a complicated and tricky issue because, as I said, there is a balance between understanding that we need money just to do the work that we're doing, but also understanding that it does reach a point where money can actually be counterproductive to the
Yeah.
struggle with not people.
I believe Julius Nyerere came from a wealthy family as well. If my memory serves me
I
correct.
think his father was a chief, I believe.
Yeah, and he he came back from his studies, abroad to help his people. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, and
so when
you
you
know,
got that passion, you got that passion. But we, like you say, activism is much easier when you ain't got to worry about keeping the lights on. Unfortunately, our some of our more prominent leaders in the America, they had to worry about money. Malcolm X had to worry about money. Martin Luther King had to worry about money. Unfortunately, that's how it was. I think as generations go on, it should be a progression. It should be an advancement so that we create institutions or businesses, or even if you work a job, you shouldn't have to worry about money, because that's worrying about money and not being able to finance things that you want to do and accomplish. It can kill your movement. A lot of people got great ideas, don't have the money to execute them, and don't have a means of getting that money, so like you said, it's just a balance. You got to be careful where the money's coming from and who's controlling, what. But I definitely agree with what you were saying. Talk to us about Mr. Carmichael, Kwame Ture.
yeah, I think to me, he's one of the most fascinating and complex figures in the Pan-African movement. I mean, just when you think about his background, he was born in Trinidad, came to prominence in the civil rights movement in the United States, and spent the last 30 years of his life in Guinea, West Africa. So, I mean, right there, you're dealing with someone who was born in the Caribbean, struggled in the United States, and then ended up struggling in Africa. And,
Yeah, he's
you
got a
know,
range of perspectives there.
yeah, the range of perspectives, and just I mean, the thing that fascinates me about him too is like when he speaks about Pan Africanism, he's speaking about someone that has so many different experiences working with African people around the world. Because not only was he born in Trinidad, but he maintained his connections, his connection to Trinidad and to the Caribbean. So he worked, very closely with some of the Pan Africanists in the Caribbean. Obviously, his work in the United States and his work on the continent. So to me, he's just fascinating simply from the perspective of a Pan Africanist who has so much global experience organizing African people around the world. And you know, one of the things I would mention about him as well, and this kind of relates to what we were speaking about earlier, that he came out of that movement in the '60s, and most of the people who came out of that movement, the ones who weren't assassinated or imprisoned, tended to compromise or even outright sell out in certain ways. And what I admire about Kwame Ture is that he never compromised at all. I mean, so many of the people that he organized with, I mean, just like when you look at SNCC and the work he's doing in SNCC, and how many people from that movement who came out of that movement end up being politicians in the Democratic Party, such as John Lewis, and then here's Kwame Ture, who very well could have compromised as well and become a politician in the Democratic Party or live some kind of comfortable life. And instead of doing that, he went all the way to one of the poorest countries in Africa, and he struggled for that, the African Revolution for the last 30 years of his life. So I think of Kwame Ture as a very uncompromising person, and that's especially significant because, as I said, he was uncompromising even in a circumstance where so many of the people that he'd worked with and that he had organized with had compromised, and he refused to compromise at all. And I've learned so much just from listening to his lectures, and the book that he wrote, Black Power, has been one of the influential books to me in terms of just how I think about Black political power.
Absolutely. Like you said in the beginning, he's a very very interesting figure. From Trinidad to Harlem, New York, to the Bronx. His works with the Nonviolent Action Group, and then working with SNCC to the Freedom Rides. To Selma and Montgomery marches. And you get all the way to the COINTELPRO era where he was targeted, the DC riots, and then you get all the way later in his life to the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So you're like, man, like this guy has a lot.
And even just the people that he's worked with, from reading his autobiography and from listening to his speeches, he's talked about personal work he's done with Kafra Kamban from Trinidad, who's part of the Emancipation Support Committee there. Kafra Kamban, I mentioned earlier the Black Power movement in Trinidad. Kafra Kamban was one of the members of that uprising against Eric Williams' government. So Kwame Ture's worked with him. He'd worked with Martin Luther King, worked with Sekou Toure in Guinea. Kwame Nkrumah worked with Muammar Gaddafi. So I mean, even fascinating just from the perspective of people that Kwame Ture's personally worked with within the Pan-African struggle. And it touches so many different prominent leaders in the African world throughout the continent and throughout the diaspora.
Right. I mean, him dying in Guinea, it says a lot. I mean, he was everywhere. He was everywhere. I think he married a South African singer at one point. I mean, the brother was everywhere. I mean, he did a lot. I think that book with him and Charles Hamilton, that's the first time that I heard or heard mention of the term institutional racism. And I think he gets credit, for that. I mean, some people have even suggested, that he was one of the first people to use the term, Black Power. So he's another one of those people, like many people we've talked to or talked about today, just don't get enough credit. Kwame Kwame Ture is just a man that dedicated his life to Black liberation, and he should be celebrated more. But yeah, a multitude of experiences in his life. Now, I wanted to ask you about your book. This book interests me. I'm probably going to purchase this book, Eshu Legba and the Devil. See. This is my lane right here. I'm interested.
I'm
You
working on
know,
right.
you know, oh yeah, I gotta get that one from you.
Yeah.
Because that is a topic that I laugh at continuously. And this is the reason why I laugh. People that have been involved in Eshu's worship from a Yoruba perspective, Eshu is very non-conforming. He doesn't conform to anything. So it's very Eshu-like that some people regard him as the devil and some people say he's Jesus. It's almost perfect because Eshu would say, I am both and neither. That's just the nature of him when you read stories about Eshu. You know, the two colors, the crossroads, the left, the right, the Ajagun, the benevolent beings. He's everywhere and he can go anywhere. They say Eshu can throw a rock from yesterday uh and hit you in the past. You know, that's just him. uh so talk to us about that book and what was your premise of writing that book.
Yeah, so this book, like most of the books I've written, it's a collection of different essays on various different topics. But the title comes from one of the main essays in the book, which is about what you were saying, but how people kind of associate Yeshu with the devil. But what was interesting to me is that many people really don't know about this, but Robert Johnson and a lot of other blues artists, there was a popular legend about how they got their music abilities by selling their soul to the devil at the crossroads. Now, most people would hear that story and think they're making some kind of deal with Satan, the Christian devil. But I was doing research, and when I realized that even though they're referring to the devil, they're not really referring to Satan. They're referring to Yeshu or to
Oh
Legba.
wow.
When you look at the comparison, because first of all, the devil at the crossroads, who stands at the crossroads?
Who
That's where.
stands at the crossroads other than Eshu?
Then it's even deeper because when you look at when you hear the physical description of what this devil at the crossroads looks like, he's an old man who walks with a limp. That's how
Oh
Yeshu
wow. That's a
was.
legba.
Yeah, the old man walking, with a limp. So, to me, it was interesting because, as I said, if you don't really investigate these things, you'll hear it's a story about blues artists selling the souls to the devil at the crossroads, and you're thinking it's something demonic or satanic. But what it actually is it's an African survival. It's African spiritual belief that survived in the diaspora, and it survived in such a way where the Africans in the United States, those blues artists, they weren't referring to that particular being as Yeshu or Legba. They were calling that being devil because that's what Europeans had depicted Yeshu as the
Right.
devil. They were
Right.
taking the European language and incorporating that into their traditional beliefs to keep those beliefs alive. And that was very profound, and it sent the message of African culture is so strong that it survives in ways that aren't even readily apparent to us, but that is a form of survival. And I always love telling that story because so many people who are blues fans, in particular, that know about that legend of the devil at the crossroads, just have no idea that that's actually referring to an African tradition.
I had no idea. Never investigated that, but when you said crossroads, my antennas peaked up. I was like, wait, what?
Man, at the
And that is
crossroads,
a big part uh, of the culture that comes out of Europe and people. That's any sheshe making pacts with Eshu. It's a deal. Eshu, if you allow me to whatever, feed my family, take care of my children, be safe in this period of time, I will reward you with offerings of, whatever, cola nuts, rokbo, tea, atare, all of these different offerings. And one of the biggest ones was palm oil when dealing with eshu. Uh, but that's definitely a part of the culture. But I never thought about it in the context in which you just said it, but it fits amongst the blues artists. That's fascinating, man. And I'm speaking from just the Yoruba perspective, but we know there are similar deities, in throughout West Africa, these trickster divinities, that carry the attributes of Eshu. You have Elegbara, you have Legba, you have Papa Legba in the Haitian tradition, you have Anansi in Ghana. There's so many different types,
I wrote about that too because one of the things I mentioned in the essay, I mentioned, and obviously I mentioned the Brer Rabbit stories, which
oh
come from
yeah,
Africa as well.
oh yeah,
And one of the things that fascinated me too is that these trickster characters, they became very important for Africans who were slaves on the plantation because we read about slave rebellions and those things happen, but the reality is that most of the resistance enslaved Africans engaged in was not outright physical rebellion. It was just day to day type of thing. So those trickster characters became very important because those trickster characters became a model for the day to day resistance among African people. They became a model for recognizing that if you're physically subjugated and you can't physically strike out against your enemy, the way that you rebel and resist is by tricking your enemy, by outsmarting your enemy. Something that we find enslaved Africans doing, very often on the plantation, engaging in trickery. So I think one of the reasons why these trickster characters, tended to survive and be so prominent in African diaspora culture is that African people on the slave plantations really connected to this, these characters who use their minds to outsmart enemies rather than just, engaging in physical violence. And one of my favorite Anansi stories was he engages in a tug of war contest with an elephant and the whale. And how he does it is he tricks elephant and whale into having a tug of war contest between themselves. And he waits till they tire each other out, and he goes and he brags to each one of them, making it seem like he beat them. So that to me is very fascinating because it shows that African culture not only survived in the diaspora but was used in very practical ways, for Africans on the plantations in terms of how could they utilize the culture to survive and as a form of resistance.
Yeah. The trickery, the outsmarting. These divinities are just known for that. So I definitely could see African slaves drawing inspiration and remembering stories, or telling stories to other slaves before rebellions and other things, because that's just the nature of those divinities. What comes to mind is the now canceled series of American Gods. When I don't know if you've seen it, but what is that guy's name? Orlando Jones is playing Anansi, and he appears before the slaves and tells them, what's going to happen to them in the new world and how they need to fight and resist. And he was a key, figure for that in that show. That's why they got rid of him in the third season. They took him out, but that was something that is really not talked about. How much our traditions played in the revolts in America amongst the slaves. Um, and I think that's because of the religious dogma that we adopted as being assimilants into Christian and Islam and other faiths. But it's undeniable when you start to look at these archaeological digs and them finding divination tools and beads and all of these African motifs that suggest cultures from back home. As Amos Wilson likes to remind people in many of his lectures, Africans didn't come here as Christians. So it's just something to where, when you do that research, you'll find so many deities that were trying to be, kept alive by our ancestors. You see the cosmograms drawn in holes like in churches that come from the Congo. You see the bones and the cowrie shells and other tools of divination uh, in Virginia and other places that were housing slaves. And I actually have a section about this in my book, so I don't want to give too much away. But the traditions of Africa, our community of memory, was preserved, sometimes subconsciously and then sometimes purposely, by our ancestors. So it's I'm definitely gonna have to get that book from you to check that out, man. That's a very interesting topic. If anybody has any questions for brother Omowale Wong, please ask him now. If not, we're getting ready to wrap up. I thank everybody for coming out. Thank everybody for watching and participating. Like I said, try to bring qualified people on the show. Check out brother Omowale Wong's books on Amazon. Just type his name in, it'll come up, and support the brother, support Black authors. If you haven't got Spears of the Mossy, volume 1, 2, and 3, support that by the Kofi Piche research team. If you haven't got Killmonger's Corner, the Pan-African Journal for the Conscious Community, produced by myself, volume 1 and 2, support that. Support Black authors as we continue in our struggle to educate African people towards liberation. Speaking of which, brother, it'd be mighty nice. I got an article for you for volume 3. Because that's going to be in the works probably next year. Probably I'll drop one next year. I got to finish my book next year. I mean, I got to finish my book this year. And I'll probably drop another journal next year. Because that's just what I got to do. I got to finish my solo book. I don't know if I'm going to get to 20. But I'm going to finish this book, Okay, brother Sundiata Ata Nzambi says, what are your thoughts on hoodoo?
Hoodoo?
Yes.
Don't really have a whole lot of thoughts. It's not something that I've done a whole lot of research on, but what I can say, and I discovered this through the same research that I was doing to discover what I said about the devil being Yeshu and Legba and the blues, that a lot of blues artists, I know for a fact that sung about hoodoo and incorporated hoodoo traditions into the art form. So to me, when I think of African survivalists, particularly in the United States, I always point to the fact that the blues has a lot of those African traditions, and I think many of us aren't even consciously aware of how African the blues actually is in terms of traditions. So when I think of hoodoo, I think of it as another example of an African tradition that has survived in the United States, and is something that many of us don't even realize is an African tradition. For example, the term mojo. So many people hear that term and know about that term mojo and don't necessarily understand that there's a hoodoo connection behind that word and there's an African connection. So I could speak of hoodoo in terms of it being an African survival and its importance in the blues art form. But beyond that, hoodoo is not something that I've done a whole lot of research on.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about the mojo and its African connotations. We say stuff all the time. We don't really know where they come from. I got to get my mojo back. And people are like, oh, okay, but they don't realize, the African connotations of mojo. What are they talking about? And it's not like this is something that's hidden. I think it's even a Wikipedia page on mojo. And it's talking about that medicine bag, that satchel of medicine, which is an African bag that's used in many traditions from voodoo and Isheshe and other things. But we heard it on Austin Powers, we didn't really know what it was. But yeah, the gree bags and the root bags and all of that. It gives a new connotation to get your mojo back. Give me my bag back, my bag of medicine back. There's even songs in jazz and in blues, about the hoodoo man,
Yeah.
running around town, cooking up jive and stuff like that. And, people were just dancing, didn't know really what they were saying, especially in blues and jazz. There's a lot of African um, connotations in those two musical genres and their creation. That's something that I'll go into a little bit in my book that I'm producing. Um, and it's got to be talked about because, when you talk about music, I always say this: when you talk about music, you're talking about Africans. That's just
Yeah.
how it goes. So I think we've been going for an hour and 30. We're gonna wrap this up. Thank you all for coming out. Continue to support the Mossy Warrior Clan. Continue to support Kofi Piche TV research team. Continue to support me, your brother Blak Panther. I appreciate you all. Until next time, please like, share, subscribe, especially share, so everybody can know about this broadcast. And I will say to you, Odabo.